Long ago, nestled between the rolling green hills, there stood a mighty kingdom called Noorstan. It was a land of breathtaking beauty. Towering castles rose above the valleys. Golden wheat fields stretched as far as the eye could see, and rivers sparkled like silver ribbons under the morning sun. And at the heart of it all sat a king. His name was King Edward. Powerful, feared, respected. His armies were vast. His treasury overflowed with gold and silver coins stacked to the ceiling. His rule stretched across mountains, forests, and distant villages that most men had never even seen. By every measure, King Edward had everything a man could ever want. But there was something strange, something that kept him awake at night. No matter how many battles he won, no matter how many treasures he collected, there was a quiet, hollow feeling deep inside his chest, a feeling that refused to go away. Every night, when the entire palace fell silent, and only the slow footsteps of the guards echoed through the stone hallways, King Edward would walk to his window and stare up at the dark sky, and he would think, what is the real purpose of this life? One night, the moon was full and impossibly bright, painting the entire kingdom in pale silver light. King Edward sat alone in his chamber, and then, without warning, 3 questions rose in his mind like flames. 3 questions so powerful, so deeply unsettling, that he felt them shake something loose inside him. He whispered them aloud to himself in the quiet dark. What is the most important time? Who is the most important person? What is the most important thing to do? He sat with those questions for a long time. Then slowly, a smile crossed his face. If I can find the answers to these 3 questions, he thought, I will never make a wrong decision again, and Noorstan will become the greatest kingdom the world has ever seen. By the time the sun rose the next morning, King Edward had made up his mind. He summoned his council and issued a royal decree. The announcement rang out across every town, every village, every corner of the kingdom. Whosoever can answer the king's 3 questions shall be rewarded with gold, and shall receive the king's highest honor. The news spread like wildfire, through forests and city streets, across rivers and mountain passes. The word traveled fast. Scholars and philosophers packed their bags. Generals polished their armor. Merchants left their shops. Healers closed their doors, all of them making their way toward the castle, each one certain they held the answer. On the day of the great court gathering, the throne room was filled beyond capacity. Hundreds of men stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices buzzing with anticipation. Tall candles flickered along the stone walls, casting long dancing shadows across the floor. King Edward sat upon his golden throne, his eyes steady and sharp. I will ask 3 questions, he announced, his voice echoing through the hall. The man who answers correctly will be greatly rewarded. Silence fell like a curtain. Then the king spoke his 3 questions aloud. The first to step forward was a great scholar, white-haired and confident, his long robes sweeping across the floor. Your Majesty, he said with a bow, the most important time is the future. For a wise man always prepares for what is yet to come. King Edward nodded slowly, but something in his chest did not settle. Next came a senior minister, well-dressed and smooth-tongued. The most important person, he declared, is the king himself, for it is the king's decisions that shape the destiny of an entire nation. A few heads in the crowd nodded in agreement, but King Edward's brow furrowed. Then a general stepped forward, broad-shouldered and proud. The most important thing to do, he said firmly, is to build military strength. For when a kingdom is powerful, everything else falls into place. Some in the court applauded, but the king pressed his lips together. One by one, more men came forward, and one by one, their answers all differed. The most important time is yesterday, so we can learn from it. The most important person is your closest friend. The most important thing is prayer. The most important thing is wealth. Every answer was different. None of them felt right. Finally, King Edward rose from his throne, his patience worn thin. None of you, he said quietly, have answered my questions correctly. The hall went dead silent. The king sat back down, looking tired and heavy. It was then that an old advisor slowly made his way forward, leaning on a carved wooden staff. Your Majesty, the old man said gently. If you truly wish to find the answers to these questions, there is only one man who can help you. And who is that? The king asked. A hermit, said the old advisor. He lives alone in the hills beyond the forest. He never comes to court. He never seeks out kings or lords. But the people who have met him say that he carries a wisdom that cannot be found in any book. King Edward leaned forward. Then I will go to him. The next morning, before the castle had fully woken, King Edward dressed in plain, ordinary clothes. No crown, no royal coat, no sign of his rank. Only one trusted soldier rode with him. They set off on horseback as the mist still clung to the fields, riding deep into the ancient forest, climbing higher and higher into the hills as the trees grew thicker and the air grew colder. Hours passed. The birds changed. The light changed. And then, in a small, quiet valley between two mossy hills, they found him, an old man, thin and weathered like a tree that had survived 100 storms. He was kneeling in front of a small stone cottage, digging the earth with a worn shovel. His hands trembled with every stroke. King Edward climbed down from his horse and walked over. Old man, he said respectfully, I have come to ask you 3 questions. I have heard that you are very wise. The hermit did not look up. He kept digging. King Edward waited, then tried again. These questions are very important to me. Still nothing. The old man just kept slowly turning the soil, breathing with quiet effort. King Edward looked at the trembling hands and the bent back, and something in him shifted. You look exhausted, he said. Here, let me dig for a while. He reached out his hand. The hermit paused, then without a word, handed him the shovel. King Edward dug. The afternoon sun moved slowly across the sky. He dug, and he waited, and the hermit sat nearby and watched. 1 hour passed, then 2. Still, the hermit said nothing. As the golden light of evening began to stretch along across the hills, King Edward finally stopped. He leaned on the shovel and said, Old man, if you do not wish to answer my questions, that is all right. I will return to my kingdom. He handed back the shovel and turned to leave. And that is when it happened. From the dark line of trees at the edge of the clearing, a man came stumbling out. He crashed to the ground just a few feet away. His leg was soaked in blood. His face was pale as ash. He was gasping and trembling, barely able to lift his head. King Edward and the hermit both froze. Then the king moved, without thinking, without hesitating. He knelt beside the stranger and tore a strip from his own clothing. He pressed it firmly against the wound to stop the bleeding. He lifted the man gently and carried him inside the cottage. He built a small fire to keep him warm. He gave him water. He sat beside him through the night, changing the cloth on the wound, cooling the man's fevered brow, watching over him like he would watch over his own brother. The forest outside grew dark and still. Only the sound of crickets and the soft crackle of the fire broke the silence. Stars filled the sky above the cottage roof. At some point in the deep of the night, King Edward looked down at the wounded stranger and thought, I am a king, and tonight I am caring for a man I do not even know. But the strange thing was, he felt more at peace than he had in years. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the trees, the man's eyes slowly opened. He looked up at King Edward, and his eyes filled with tears. Thank you, he whispered. Please, forgive me? King Edward frowned gently. Forgive you? For what? The man swallowed hard. You do not recognize me, he said quietly, but I know who you are. You're King Edward. The king said nothing. He waited. I'm your enemy. The man continued, his voice breaking. I came here to kill you. The words hung in the air like smoke. King Edward sat very still. The man pressed on, tears now running freely down his face. A few years ago, during the war, your soldiers killed my brother. He was innocent. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they cut him down without asking questions. He paused, struggling to breathe. That day I swore I would find you. I would take my revenge. When I heard you were coming to see the hermit, I followed you. I hid in the trees and I waited. But your soldier spotted me first. He wounded me, and I ran, and I ended up here. Silence. You didn't know any of this, the man said softly, and yet you saved my life. He tried to sit up but was too weak. Instead, he reached out and placed his trembling hand over his heart. I'm ashamed. I beg your forgiveness. If I survive, I will spend the rest of my life in your service." For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled quietly. King Edward looked at this man, this stranger, his enemy, the man who had come into the hills with murder in his heart. And he felt not anger, not fear, something softer, something unexpected. He reached out and placed a steady hand on the man's shoulder. "I forgive you," he said. The man stared at him, disbelief written all over his face. "Not only that," King Edward continued, "I will personally look into what happened to your brother. If an injustice was done, it will be corrected. You have my word." The man broke down completely. He sobbed like a child, his whole body shaking. "You are a great man," he kept saying. "You are a great man?" Morning came soft and golden. The birds returned to the trees. The wounded man slept peacefully, his color already returning. King Edward stepped outside the cottage to find the old hermit sitting quietly on a log, watching the mist rise off the valley below. The king sat down beside him. "Old man," he said, "I still haven't received the answers to my 3 questions. The hermit turned to look at him, and a slow, gentle smile spread across his ancient face. "You already have your answers," he said simply. King Edward blinked. "How?" The hermit spoke quietly, like a man reading from something written a long time ago. "Yesterday, when you were digging the earth for me, what was the most important time?" The king said nothing, listening. "It was that moment, right then, because if you had left and gone back to your castle, that man hiding in the trees would have killed you on the road. The most important time was the present moment. Always, it is the present moment." King Edward felt something shift deep inside him, and the most important person at that time, the hermit continued, was me, because I was the one standing in front of you, needing help. He paused, letting the words settle like stones into still water. Then the wounded man arrived, and he became the most important person, because he needed you most in that moment. "And the most important thing to do," the hermit said, his voice barely above a whisper, "was to do good, to help, to care for the person in front of you." He looked at the king directly. "That is why you are alive today, and that is why your enemy is now your friend." King Edward sat in complete silence for a long time. He thought about all the years he had spent chasing power, building walls, collecting gold, fighting wars, worrying about the past, planning for a future that had not yet arrived. And all along, the answer had been so breathtakingly simple. Be here. Care for the person in front of you. Do good, right now. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt completely still inside. When King Edward returned to his castle, he gathered his entire court and told them everything. What had happened in the hills, what the hermit had said, what he had learned. The great hall was silent when he finished. Then, slowly, an old advisor spoke. "Your Majesty, if we live by these 3 truths, Noorstan could become the greatest kingdom in the world. Not in arms, not in gold, but in the hearts of its people." The king nodded. "Then that is what we shall build." From that day forward, everything changed. King Edward issued new laws, not of conquest, but of compassion. He opened the royal treasury to feed the hungry. He built hospitals for the sick. He sent his soldiers not to raid and fight, but to protect and serve. But most importantly, the king himself changed. He no longer sat distant and untouchable on his golden throne. He walked through villages. He sat with farmers and listened to their troubles. He visited the sick. He learned the names of ordinary people. His subjects could not believe what they were seeing. They had never known a king like this. And slowly, like spring coming after a long winter, the kingdom began to bloom. The poor found comfort. The fearful found safety. Enemies became allies. Strangers became neighbors. One evening, King Edward stood alone on the high tower of his castle, looking out over the rolling hills of Noorstan. As the last light of the sun melted into the horizon, the same full moon was rising that had been there the night. His 3 questions were born. But tonight, there was no hollow feeling in his chest, only peace. He smiled quietly to himself and said aloud, "The answer was always so simple, and it took me so long to find it." He looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you for showing me the truth before it was too late." King Edward never became less powerful, but he became something rarer. He became good. And long after his reign had ended, long after the castle stones had worn smooth with time, people still told his story around fires and at bedsides and in village squares. They always ended it the same way. There are only 3 things that truly matter in this life. The most important time is now. The most important person is whoever is standing in front of you. And the most important thing you can do is simply be good to them. These 3 lessons changed one king's entire life, and they can change yours too.